Yelayu Utsai, a man 39 years of age, unusually tall, with a long beard and mustache. The Chinese nicknamed him Long Mustache. Yelayu Utsai had learned to hold both his tongue and his temper, descendant of a Cathayan priest, and son of a father who had served the Qin dynasty faithfully. Yelayu Utsai had devoured books as a boy, an expert mathematician. He had experimented with calendars. He had a strange hobby, puzzling out geography for himself, and not content with the Chinese system of astronomy. He had worked out new calculations of his own. Eliu Tsai had a genius for applying abstract thought. He could put aside his books to deal just as effectively with human problems. At 20, he had been governor of Yanqing. When the Mongols captured this city, his tall figure and deep voice had caught the eye of Genghis Khan. The Qin were enemies of the Kathayans. The old Mongol observed to him, "And so it happens that I have avenged you." "My father and I," Yelayu Utsai replied, "I've always served the Qin. How, then, could they be our enemies?" This straightforward answer pleased the Mongol Khans, who took the young minister into his service, believing that if the Kathayan could be faithful to the Qin dynasty, he couldn't be trusted to aid the Mongols. The frontiersman Alexander had found in Aristotle. At first, Genghis Khan called on the Yelayu Utsai for astrological predictions, and the Cathay used his wit to good purpose. Okay, well, frontiersman doesn't really work for Alexander, does it? I mean, he's a horse rider and all that, but not, you know. But yeah, no, that doesn't work as a replacement for that. But I'm not saying that people, because they speak a different language or they're part of a different tribe or nation or different religion or something, that they're, barbarians. No, I'm not saying that at all. Once, when he had selected a day for the departure of the Mongols on the western expedition, it snowed to a depth of 3 feet. Genghis Khan, doubtful at this, asked Yelayu Utsai to explain the meaning of the omen. "It signifies," the Chithayan answered at once, "that the lord of the cold northern region will conquer the king of the warm south." And this proved to be the case. A certain Tangatan, famous for his skill at making bows, was contemptuous of the learned Kathayan. "What business has a man of books," he demanded, "among a fellowship of warriors? To make bows," Yelayu Utsai retorted, "a woodworker is needed, but when it comes to governing an empire, a man of wisdom is needed." Genghis Khan heard of this reply, and it pleased him. Still, he was careful to check the Chathayan's predictions about the ancient augury of the tribes by placing the shoulder blade of a sheep in the fire and studying the cracks that appeared on it. He made use of Yelayu Utsai's brains as he availed himself of planks to build a bridge to cross a river that could not otherwise be crossed. He demanded only one thing of his advisor: integrity. And that rare quality Yelayu Utsai possessed. The philosopher was a match for the inflexible conqueror. Yelayu Utsai could read the matter-of-fact Mongols like a written book, but they never understood him. He was a follower of Confucius, serving an ideal of conduct so vague that for the frontiersman it did not exist. Once, in the defiles of the lower Himalayas, Genghis Khan dreamed that a miraculous animal, shaped like a deer but green in color, and with only a single horn, appeared in his path. Disturbed, he called upon Yelayu Utsai for an explanation of the phenomenon. It cried out in a human voice, he asserted, saying, "Turn back quickly. That strange animal is Tuan, the Cathayan answered gravely. He knows every language, and he loves living men. He has a horror of slaying. His appearance to you is a warning. You, the Khan, possess the power of heaven. You know, the whole metanomial thing again. But the living men of the earth are your children. You are responsible for them. Again, a metaphor that a lot of people, particularly most Christians, don't really understand. Same thing with the Jews and the whole Abraham thing. To be of the house of Abraham, in the ideal way, has nothing. I mean, in the best way, has nothing to do with whether you're physically descended from him or not, or anyone from that region, for that matter. Whatever he may have thought of this, Genghis Khan turned back from his intended march through the Himalayas. So Long Mustache rode the whirlwind of carnage and tried to rein it, laboring to bring order out of the chaos of destruction. While he did so, he mapped the geography of the unknown western regions and collected herbs and cuttings of fruit. When an epidemic attacked the Mongols, he enjoyed a philosopher's revenge. He dosed them with rhubarb and cured them. He was made Chinese secretary, and he found himself placed beside the two other advisors of the old Mongol, Mahmud Yelvaj, a wise Turk, and Chin Kai, a Uyghur, an elderly man of letters, a Christian nicknamed Lord Koloni by the Mongols, and the Mongols respected these three men of wisdom who had won their way out of captivity by showing no fear. Even Tului listened to Long Mustache. When the Kuriltai buzzed with argument after 40 days of indecision, Eliu Tsai spoke to Tului. The day that is to come, he said, will be the 22nd of the 8th moon, and it will be auspicious for the naming of the Khan. Now, I'm recording this during the 8th month of the sacred year 1442. And definitely have yet to see what's going to happen on the 22nd, right? It's the 10th right now, right? Oh, no, I guess it's 11th. Silently, Tului considered and shook his head. No one is ready, he objected. Let it be put off to another day. After tomorrow, no day will be auspicious, and when the council convened the next morning, Yaliu Chutsai sought out the brooding Chakatay prince. He said quietly, "You are the eldest, but you are also the subject of the Khan. Unless you bow first to the Khan to be, who else will dare proclaim him?" He had invoked the tribal law, and Chagatai could be influenced by a point of law. His hesitation vanished as the Chathayan led him towards Ogadai. "What are we doing?" Chagatai cried. The father himself commanded that Ogadai be seated in his stead. There was silence in the pavilion while the Mongols who had argued for Tului and the army, and those who had wished for Chagatai and tribal law, watched the three brothers intently. Chagatai seized the right arm of the surprised Ogadai, and Tului, never slow to act, ran forward to grasp his left hand. "Come on, ox," he laughed. Ogadai, massive as a bear, resisted until an uncle pushed through the crowd to grasp his wrist, and these three kinsmen carried him toward the throne seat covered with gray felt. They forced him down on it. Chagatai took off his cap and loosened the girdle from his hips, throwing it over his shoulder. Then he bent his knee 3 times before Ogadai. Ogadai, his harsh voice proclaimed, "You are Kakan. Hearing this word spoken, the Noyans and chieftains of tribes took off their girdles and headgear and knelt before their new Kakan. Hastily, Tului filled a goblet with wine and offered it to his brother, now his ruler with immutable power over the three different branches of the Alpine Uruk, the Golden Family over the chieftains who were the steppe aristocracy over the Mongol clans, the personal army of the former Khakan, Genghis, and all the peoples who dwelt in felt tents and distant from them, the peoples of the earth itself. Look, O my Khakan, he said, as Ogadai drank mechanically, they stretch out their necks to thee and hang the cord of servitude upon them. The hundreds who knelt gave tongue calling Ogadai by the name of Khakan, a keeper of the door, went out into the sunlight to pour wine from a goblet toward the four quarters of the sky. When Ogadai came out to kneel to the everlasting sky, the waiting thousands hailed him. Amazed, Ogadai listened to the salutations of the inscrutable Yelayu Utsai and that tolerant soul, Yel Vaj. I told the father, he objected. I could not argue with him about his choice, but I feared that my sons and their sons would be worthless and unable to sit on the throne. Then he said, if all the sons of Ogadai and their sons turn out to be worthless, can it be that of all my descendants one worthy enough will not be found? These words were heard and remembered, but their immediate effect was to draw from the assembled nomads an oath that they would never place anyone upon the throne except a member of Ogadai's house, so long as there remained of his descendants a morsel of flesh large enough, if thrown into the grass, to keep cattle from eating of the grass. Now that's something. That's quite a way to speak of a baby, right? And it's not talking about a specific baby, but anyway. This oath, taken together by the Mongol nomads, contemptuous of written documents, was utterly binding, not only upon themselves, but upon future generations. A wave of rejoicing went through the encampment. The clansmen settled down to drink in earnest. Their Khakan had been chosen, and the future provided for. Eliud Utsai, who had brought it about, understood what had been in the mind of Genghis Khan. Neither Tului or Chagatai would have submitted to the other for long, yet both were devoted to Ogadai, and both would aid him to rule, so the three brothers would be united in support of the throne. In Ogadai's Ordu, Turakina held herself erect in pride, beholding herself as empress. And Siyur Kuktiti, the first wife of Tului, heard that the boy Kubilai and his brothers had been deprived of the birthright that she had sought for them. Instead of closing her tent to grieve, Siyurkuktiti robed herself in white floss silk and brushed her hair until it shone. She put rice powder on her cheeks and darkened her eyelids with kohl, and went out with her slave maidens to greet the Mongol Noyans and rejoice with them. Only she said nothing of what she kept hidden within her. The tribesmen who saw her thus commented that she carried herself like a majestic woman. Tului, they admitted, was fortunate in his chief wife. So, in the year of the ox, was held the first coronation of the nomad peers. Ogadai Khakan, a methodical and good-natured animal, an illiterate who trusted little beyond his own senses except his two brothers, who remembered clearly the years when he had to sleep, wrapped in furs, under the snow, and to stifle his hunger with grass, chewed to a pulp. Now, similar to the case of Udalparibus Benuda, who wrote the Aramea original of the Book of Revelation that John of Patmos rewrote, right? at the start of that century, rather the end of that century, um, trusted his two companions and died with his two companions, thus fulfilling his own prophecy. But when you plan to lead, it's not really much of a prophecy when you plan to lead a charge with your two companions that, slim chance of your survival, Ogadai. But I mean, having two close companions that he trusted, that's the analogy. That was, Ogadai, in middle age, was too old to change, and he had no slightest inclination to go to school to learn. He feared only one thing, the spirit life of his father that hovered about the great Ordu. He desired most of all to stuff himself with hot meats and sugared fruits. His first command was to hold 3 days of mourning for Genghis Khan, a morning feast, steaming horseflesh, sizzling torn mutton, and roasted beef were to be set before every man, with bowls of mare's milk and wine. To propitiate the spirit life of his father, he selected 40 girls young enough to be virgins. Picking them out from the families of the chieftains, he had them dressed in Chinese garments and adorned them with glowing precious stones and shining them. I presume glowing kind of makes it sound like they're radioactive, but why? Why refer to women as girls? That's kind of disrespectful, I think. But this is Harold Lamb's doing, Then he had them led to the grave near the Burkhan Khaldun, where the body of Genghis Khan sat under the roots of the giant pine with the bones of his warhorse. 40 of the best white stallions were brought to this tree, where the reindeer tribe kept watch. The Becky made the sacrifice, the fair girls were strangled, and the horses slain, to go to serve the soul of Genghis Khan. After this, Ogadai emptied the carts that stood on a rise by the encampment. These carts had been there for months unguarded. Out of them came bars of silver, chests of pearl, carved ivory and cinnabar, gleaming jade figures, and soft beaten gold, rolls of silk, heaped up precious stones, the spoils of the last campaign still undistributed. They had been left unguarded because theft was at that time unheard of among the Mongols. He made a gift of this treasure to the multitude at the Kuriltai. Our Khakan, he said, raised our imperial house with great trouble. Now it is time to take the burden from the peoples and to give to all peace and prosperity. The Khakan, your father, Yaliu Utsai, warned him, conquered an empire in the saddle, but it cannot be governed from the saddle. Ogadai was not ready to admit that. It had been the conception of Genghis Khan that the nomads were to make slaves of the settled peoples. Once masters of the land itself, the nomads were to remain free from settled habitation, while the surviving townspeople labored within walls to support them. Assenting to this, Yaliu Utsai pointed out that the conquest was one thing, and administration another. Yearly taxes had to be levied, and supplies stored in granaries. Communications had to be kept open, and judgments given. To make a vase, he suggested, you avail yourself of a potter. To keep accounts and records, learned men should be used. Well, Ogadai demanded, what hinders thee from making use of them? Yaliu Utsai admitted that most of the educated men he needed were Kathayans, imprisoned or in slavery, and he asked for a yarlig, a written command to free them so that they could hold office. He also persuaded Ogadai to appoint officers who were not of the army in conquered regions, where human carcasses still littered the public squares. He argued that the civilian population should be judged before being executed, and the Khakan conceded this. Instead of general looting, the Kathayan argued that a regular tax would bring greater supplies and treasure to the Ordu. Ogadai was skeptical about that. When Yaliu Utsai predicted that a tax of one animal in 100 upon the nomads and 1/10 of their produce in wine, rice, grain, salt upon the conquered settlements would fetch in yearly over 500,000 ounces of silver to the treasury of the Ordu. But as what the Cathayan predicted usually came to pass, Ogadai agreed to experiment with that arrangement. Most vital of all, he kept the hard-working Chinkai as Secretary of State. No, your leagues were to be effective unless they bore Chinkai's seal. Mahmud Yul Vajd he selected for his minister, and Yeliu Chautai for his governor of North China. Ogadai had ideas of his own when the first merchants from the caravan routes arrived at his ordu, hastening to offer their carpets and plate and curios to the new Khan. Ogadai accepted everything at the merchant's valuation, which was exorbitant. When the officers of his personal treasury protested that he was being swindled, he admitted it. These men came, he said, expecting to make a profit from me, and I do not wish them to go away disappointed. A beggar appeared weekly before the Khan, always asking for a balash of silver, and Ogadai ordered it given him. After he asked the beggar what he wanted it for, to pay some debts that I owe, to buy me some new garments, and to drink my fill. The man answered boldly. And Ogadai discovered presently that his officers were not paying the spendthrift. He ordered his Mongols to pay the petitioner 2 balashes of silver every time he said that they failed to pay, the amount would be doubled. He makes good use of the silver, the Khan explained, and there are just as many balashes handed around as before. Eventually, this one will come back to your coffer from which you took it. He had all a nomad's craving for possessions that he could use, and indifference to stored up wealth, and he was angered when his officers objected to his giving away the precious metals. I cannot take such things out of the world with me, he cried. You are trying to injure me. Am I not to have a good name for giving, when that is the only thing about me that will endure? And the ancient Egyptians also, the name was one of the 9 things about the individual that you want to endure, Somehow, Ogadai learned of a custom of the kin, or golden emperors, that interested him immediately. Every year, it seemed, search had been made through the lands of the kin for the loveliest of the young girls, those who were shapeliest, with melodious voices and sweet breath, were sent to the court, where the most alluring were chosen, some 50 of them, to wait upon the emperor. They tended him, they fetched wine at his pleasure, they rubbed his limbs with sandal, and they slept by his couch until he made choice of those who were to sleep with him. This struck Ogadai as a kingly and meritorious custom, and he asked Yeliu Chautai to arrange it for him, now that the Mongol Khans had made themselves greater than the kin emperors. Long Mustache objected, knowing that the Mongols favored Chinese girls who were daintier and more sophisticated than the nomad women. He foresaw a yearly conscription of the young women of Cathay. Ogadai was not pleased. The great ancestor said that no delight was equal to the joy of seeing vanquished people lying at your feet, while their fine horses are led forth for you, and the wailing of their women resounds in your ears. Above all is the joy of lying with the shapeliest of their young women, crushing their soft breast and warm thighs in your arms. Why should this be denied me? Messed up individual wanting women to cry. And be forced and all that. Have you not 28 such girls already? The Cathayan demanded. Does not that number suffice you? You will only make trouble if you go further. Pondering this, Ogadai agreed, but he insisted that Yeliu Chatsai requisition all the horses of North China, in spite of the instant objection of the Cathayan philosopher that his people, unlike the nomads, had few horses and that these were needed for agriculture. Before his death, Ogadai increased the number of his bedfellows to 60. Seldom did he sleep without experiencing the delight that different girls could yield. It did not seem to exhaust his strength. The Mongols had in them the vitality of generations of tribal life in the grasslands. Sexual weakness and abnormal sexual acts were outside their understanding as yet. In the Yasa, the code of law of Genghis Khan, fornication was punished by death, whether the guilty were married or not. Likewise, sodomy, deliberate lying, and magic. And do they just mean that one act, or do they mean the 4 non-coital acts? And what do they mean by magic? The Yasa had been dictated by Genghis Khan from time to time and traced on leaves of gold by his secretaries. These leaves of the law were only to be touched by the children of his house, who brought them forth at the councils. They were the Bible and the code of the nomads, immutable as fate. Ogadai himself could not perform an act contrary to the Yasa. If the descendants born after me, Genghis Khan had said, keep to the Yasa and do not change it, for 1,000 and 10,000 years the everlasting sky will aid and preserve them. Neither Ogadai nor his brothers could read the tracings on the golden leaves, but they had the careful memory of the illiterate for the spoken word, and they knew every saying of the Yasa, or at least Chagatai said the wild horse had the duty of enforcing the law. Eliu Chatsai understood better than they what Genghis Khan had tried to do. Before the nomads as a whole had no written laws, Genghis Khan had become acquainted with the laws of civilized people and had ignored them as worthless. He had made up his own code out of tribal customs and inhibitions that he hoped would hold his Mongols together as a clan through all changes in fortune. The Yasa forbid anyone to urinate into water or the ashes of a fire, or to wash garments in running water, a sanitary measure for the Mongols spent their lives in camps. It forbade any Mongol to eat in the presence of another without sharing his food. No one was to satisfy his hunger more than another, and a Mongol riding by a group who were eating could dismount and take a share of food without asking permission or being opposed, a measure to preserve tribal hospitality. The possession of food had meant life among the nomad. Now, some of these laws, people say, "Oh, it didn't happen to the Christians." Like, no, long before the Christians and Jews, pretty much all these types of laws were practiced by monotheists and polytheists alike. But see, the Yasa and such, they weren't revealed books. They were, Clothing must not be washed, but must be worn until it shredded apart, a memory of their early poverty. Nothing, the Yasa decreed, must be called unclean. All things are clean, and no distinction exists between clean and unclean. And men must respect religious faiths without being bound by any one faith. No one was to take sides between the different sects. In this new law of the nomads, a Buddhist was the equal of a Christian. A Taoist are those that were just simply regarded as pagan, of course, pagan and heathen to the in their Greco-Roman roots, has nothing to do with religious identification. It became hate speech as later for the later Christians. In this simple requirement, the sagacity of the Mongol conqueror made itself felt. He had come into conflict with some of the religions of civilized people, or rather emerging from his desert. He had discovered that his enemies in the settled regions were all devotees of religions. He foresaw the probability of further conflict. Above all, he understood that the